Hariom and greetings from Niagara Falls. Swami Chinmayananda, having tuned into peace, created an organization to share this peace. Chinmaya means peace, and mission is to share this peace. And his vision was most inclusive, to share peace with all demographics. Forums for kids, forums for seniors, forums for evolving adults, which we define as setukari. Those who are not established, those who are not exploring, but are in between. We are a demographic that is settling into our professions, settling into our relations, settling into our locations. That could be a city, that could be your home. And settling into can be quite unsettling, no? That was like an old Indian word, play on words, yes? It works though. This unsettling is why we've created a community of evolving adults. Since the summer of 2018, this is approaching a year and a half, a group of us from all across North America, the people you see in the different screens, we've been coming together every month, sometimes more than every month, for workshops, for retreats, focused on peace, on love, on media, and now on wellness. So who am I? You should be asking yourself that question also. My photograph is not on the poster. How come I'm speaking right now? My body is Canadian. I was born and raised and live in Canada. My mind is that of an entrepreneur. I grew up in a business family, went to business school, engaged in commercial real estate. My intellect is that of a seeker. Having finished traveling and having finished earning from 2005 to 2007, I studied the science of happiness from someone who is happy, someone who knows the destination, who knows the route. That is Swami Tejomayananda. And for the past 13 years, from January of 2008, I've been happily marrying, happily parenting. And I was thinking about that. We say happily married, right? But then we say happily parenting. How is that making sense, right? You're parenting for the long term. You're marrying for the long term too. So I'm happily marrying, happily parenting, and sharing the same happiness that was shared with me. I'm aspiring to share that same happiness through Chinmaya mission to different demographics. And a demographic that I really love to work with, because I'm part of that, is our Setukaris. So who am I is checked off now. Okay. Our first workshop, this is our introductory workshop, is entitled Taking Perspective on Mental Health. Reflect on how your grandparents grew up. You've all met your grandparents. Some more seriously, some more casually. I'm positive that your grandparents always had someone to talk to. Always had someone to listen to. Now, if you reflect on yourself, do you feel the same way? Our grandparents grew up in a community. We're growing up with connections. We have lots of Wi-Fi connections. We have lots of business connections and political connections. But we are a generation of isolation, no? Who do we have to talk to? Who do we have to listen to? Humans are social animals, and social animals need support, need to offer support too. Not just receive support, but offer support. We find completion in that. And when this support is not here, there are unseen effects. Those unseen effects are stress, anxiety, depression. If you ask someone who's casual about mental health and you say, you know, I suffer from PTSD or I suffer from anxiety, they'll say, that's why you have white hair. Right? There's that generalization, that casual nature about approaching this. But I say unseen because stress, anxiety, depression, this is what makes it hard to go to sleep. That's not seen, right? You don't see people going to sleep. This makes this hard to wake up. We see people at work, we see people at the bank and on the bus, but we don't know how it is for them to wake up. The science of happiness is known as Vedanta. Veda means science, Antaha means inside, depth, reality, happiness. Vedanta describes mental illnesses as adhi, A-D-H-I. And whatever's inside of you is going to come outside. Yes? If you're an angry person, that's going to come out through your words, through your actions. If you're a calm person, that will come out too. When adhi is expressed, this is called vyadhi. That is a physical illness, like a fractured limb. That's a vyadhi. Diabetes, that's a vyadhi. Mental illnesses are real. Otherwise, Vedanta wouldn't have a term for mental illnesses as real as cancer. Breast cancer is real, yes. Blood cancer is real, yes. So is anxiety. So is depression. And ignoring this doesn't help. Ignoring this makes this worse. There's a compound effect. There's further isolation. And I especially reference the South Asian community. A community where if you suffer from anxiety, if you have a mental health issue, what's wrong with you? How did your parents raise you? How does that make one feel when such stigma is applied? This workshop is beneficial on too many levels to describe, and us talking about this, even if there's no solution, us talking about this helps us to shift from connections to community. I study resilience, and there are 3 ways that one can become more resilient. Too many times we're taught that people are born resilient. Your sibling is more resilient than you are. You're just born like that. You have different genes. But that's not. The 3 ways that you can develop resilience is exercise, examples, and ethics. 3's. The alliteration worked. Exercise, examples, and ethics. And this is not a resilience workshop, but I want to show you how this relates to Vedanta. Exercise would be swasti, no? Physical well-being. When you exercise, when you're in the sun, you feel lifted up. Examples is satsanga. When you have role models in your life, when you have someone you can talk to, someone you can listen to, someone who can, again, lift you up, can help you to feel that you can rather than cannot do this. And ethics, we would use the terminology of shastra. Shastra means scripture. Scripture guides us into being responsible, knowing what our potential is. taking perspective on mental health, how we can help our mental health is by being swasti, that is being physically healthy, being in satsanga, not connections, but community, where I can speak to someone, I can listen to someone, and shastra, where I'm learning about what my nature is, that even beyond the mind is the spirit, and the nature of the spirit is happiness, independent joy. With this, my responsibility is complete. And I now introduce to you Madhav Khurana, who is our subject matter expert. He's a social worker whose focus is what I very lightly introduced. And he's a friend too. We grew up together. He actually came over for dinner and is sitting in my house right now. So I'm going to slide this way, and he's going to slide in this way. Enjoy.
Let me start by telling you a little bit about myself. Again, my name is Madhav. I was born and raised here in Niagara Falls, not Niagara Falls, the city just outside of Niagara Falls, Canada. I grew up with Vivekji. I went and I did my undergraduate degree at a school called McGill University, which is in Montreal, Quebec. At McGill, I studied psychology with a primary focus on neuropsychology. After that time, I went and I started working with the Canadian Mental Health Association. I was what was called a community support worker, which I supported individuals who struggled with their mental health in the community, offered some therapy, as well as just offered some support to get them back on their feet, depending on where they were in their life. After that, I decided to pursue a degree in social work. I did another bachelor's of social work. I did that at Dalhousie University, and then I did my master's at McMaster University. Throughout the entire process, my focus was specifically on mental health. That was something that I had a passion for. To this day, I still work with the same agency, the Canadian Mental Health Association. So this is my jam. Like the topic of mental health is something that's really important to me and something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. So no, this is also a topic that needs a lot of time to discuss. An hour and a half is I'm glad that we have this hour and a half, but it's quite short. So it's going to be difficult to give you a very thorough understanding of the subject. But what I wanted to do with this talk is I wanted to give you a unique perspective on mental health that you probably haven't been exposed to before. It's a perspective that I think everybody needs to be exposed to. And I'm really hoping that it can help with shifting everyone's understanding of mental health and mental illness. So I'm going to share my screen now so I can show everyone my PowerPoint. All right. Okay. So just to give everybody a little bit of understanding of where we are with mental health in our society. Now this is going to give you kind of a dark picture of where we're at. But we're not at a good place right now with mental health in our society, to say the least. Our rates of mental health issues are as high or higher than they've ever been in the history of recorded research history. And that is despite the highest rates of treatment that we have ever exposed people to. We're talking about medical treatment, as well as psychotherapy treatment. More people are getting treatment now than ever. And yet at the same time, more people are struggling now more than ever. Our suicide rates are the highest they've ever been. And recent studies have shown that adolescent mental health issues are getting worse. So things aren't in space right now. And that's why I think that maybe we need to start thinking about this topic a little bit differently. And maybe if we start thinking about this topic a little bit differently, we can reduce the stigma surrounding mental health, as well as, you know, improve the outcomes that we have in the mental health field. So I'll start by showing you guys a quote. This is a quote by Brock Chisholm, who is the first Director General of the World Health Organization. And his famous quote was that without mental health, there can be no true physical health. And I particularly like this quote, and this is a very popular quote amongst social workers, because when we think of health, we often always think of physical health. But in this, someone who's the director of a very important organization that we have in our society, a global organization, he identifies that our mental health is primary. And he also identifies that there's a strong interconnection between mental health and physical health, that these are two concepts that we cannot separate from one another. So the first idea I want to expose you to is something called the mental health continuum. Mental health is not a black or white issue. It isn't that I have mental illness or I don't have mental illness. I have mental health or I don't have mental health. It's very much on a gradient. Okay, so let me explain a little bit on how this gradient works. So on the far left, or the green area of the gradient, we would have someone who's sitting in this area would be considered healthy, or to give you an analogy, they're swimming, they're moving forward. They're able, and most importantly, they're able to perform their responsibilities that they have without problem, whether that be raising their family, whether that be their employment, whether that be their education. These individuals who are in a healthy state of mind, a well-balanced state of mind, are able to do these activities or responsibilities without much of an issue. And then we kind of move a little bit lower. And at this state, the yellow state on the continuum, when we're here, we're more or less just maintaining our mental health. We're treading water, we're surviving, we're not necessarily thriving, but we're able to get things done. We're able to meet our responsibilities. We're able to do what we need to do to get by. However, at the end of the day, we might feel mentally exhausted after completing all our responsibilities. So it isn't like we are able to perform our responsibilities and then feel good at the end of the day. Often we would feel exhausted if we're in this state. Then we move to the part of the continuum that might be considered our mental health isn't doing so well. Okay, so and in this area, you'd be considered injured or you're drowning. It's like you have this feeling like you can't hold on much longer, like you're really starting to sink, or you're starting to move backwards, essentially, when you're in this area. You're struggling to perform basic responsibilities. Maybe you are able to perform your responsibilities well at work, but then when you come home to your family life, you just don't have the capacity to balance both of those at once. So this is maybe where your mental health is struggling a little bit. And then we get to the far end of the spectrum. And this is where someone might get diagnosed with having a mental illness. At this stage, the individual feels like they're completely helpless, like they're sinking, and they're just unable to perform their responsibilities adequately. And at this stage is normally when help is required. Some form of external help is required to get us out of this stage. I would say in the other parts of the continuum, you would be able to move out of the continuum with some help, but in this stage, you really need some intensive help, some type of treatment. There's a part of that the continuum doesn't really incorporate, and that is this idea of people who are flourishing in life, people who are really thriving, people who are constantly improving, people who are just moving ahead, people who are self-mastering their life. I believe there is a part of the continuum that's even ahead of mental health, something that would be considered mental flourishing. So it's also something to just keep in mind. And I think that this kind of community, or studying the stuff we study in the Vedanta community, this is what we're seeking. We're seeking to be in this state of mind. This is the state of mind that a lot of the swamis and acharyas would probably be in. So I guess I have a reflection question. Who is immune to mental health issues? I think you probably know the answer, but we're all subject to the continuum. And that's what I really like about this idea of the continuum, is that none of us are immune to experiencing mental health issues. We may be on the far left on the green side of the spectrum, but that doesn't mean that given certain circumstances or traumas or anything that we can't end up on the red side. Okay, so we all have the possibility of struggling with our mental health. Equally so, someone who's on the red, someone who is really struggling heavily with their mental health, does not mean that they're going to be there for the rest of their life, or they're going to be on the right side of the continuum. Individuals who maybe have experienced a significant mental health issue can experience flourishing at some point in their life, and there are countless examples of that happening. So we're all subject to the continuum. There's no me and them. It's just us. We're all on this continuum. Now, the continuum can tilt in one direction or the other. So some of us might be more prone to falling in the red zone. Some of us might be a little bit more prone to experiencing mental health issues. And that can be from a number of factors. That can be genetics is just a small piece of it, but that definitely plays a role. Maybe you've experienced significant trauma throughout your life. Maybe you lived in a very unstable environment. Maybe you've experienced severe discrimination or poverty. Those can certainly tilt the continuum in that one direction. Then, yeah, some people are more prone to mental health struggles. And then the continuum can tilt in the other direction. I'm sure we all know people who were just like, this person's just always happy, like they're always doing well. And it's very possible that that person maybe has disposition to be doing really well, but they've also probably grew up in a really nurturing environment, or maybe they just figured out something. They have really supportive friends, or they have really good coping mechanisms that keep them in the healthy part of the spectrum. So, mental health is a really complex issue. It's something that the more we learn about it, the more we realize that we know very little about it. We know so little about this issue. Even recently, a lot of drug companies have just given up on creating psychiatric medication because they're just not getting any results. They just can't figure out how this works. And everybody knows, I don't know if everybody knows, but there's a story about these blind men who all go and touch different parts of the elephant, and they all describe an elephant in different ways, right? So there are various perspectives on mental health, and I want to give you a unique perspective that you probably haven't been exposed to before. So there is the dominant perspective, the perspective that you probably have all heard before, the perspective that is very common in our society. And that perspective is that the individual who struggles with a mental health issue is sick, or they have a sick brain, or something's imbalanced in their brain. That is the common perspective on this. So when we look at the sick individual perspective, the source of mental illness is an individual deficit. In that individual, they have some type of impairment or deficit, or they have some type of brain dysfunction or impairment. And so what generally is the treatment when we look at mental health this way? First, we might start with some form of diagnosing. We might label that individual as having anxiety or depression or bipolar disorder, whatever it might be. And then we might try and treat that person by balancing their brain chemicals through medication or through other forms. Or in therapy, we try and fix their faulty thought patterns, right? We're trying to get them out of experiencing that mental health issues because they're having some faulty thought patterns, and we need to fix those thought patterns. So that's generally the way that we treat mental health or mental illness when we're looking at it from this sick individual perspective. Now, there's a really cool quote I want to expose everyone to. And this quote goes like this. It says, "The worst thing to call somebody is crazy. It's dismissive. I don't understand this person, so they're crazy. That's BS. These people are not crazy. They're strong people. Maybe the environment is a little bit sick." So, anybody have any guesses on who said this? It probably will surprise you. This is what Dave Chappelle said. So this is what Dave Chappelle said after he quit. His third season of doing the Chappelle Show was probably one of the most successful comedy shows of all time. I think it sold the most DVDs of any show in history. And he signed a $50 million contract to do a third season. And in the middle of the third season, he just left. And when he tried to describe it to people, there was all these rumors to say, he went crazy. He had a mental illness. Something was wrong with him. And he just couldn't cope. And when he came back and he tried to answer the questions, he provided a different perspective. He said that, there's nothing wrong with me or with other celebrities that have experienced the same thing, or people in society who have experienced the same thing. But he pointed out that maybe it's our environment that's the problem. Maybe it's our society that's sick and not the person themselves. So he introduced us to the idea of the sick environment or the sick society perspective. There's this quote by Jiddu Krishnamurti, which I think applies really well to this subject. And he says that it is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. So again, it points to this idea that maybe there's something wrong, or maybe there's something sick about our society. And that in turn, creates sickness in individuals. And we spend all our time trying to adjust well to this sick society, and only few of us are really actually successful at doing it. There's this book recently written by Gail Saltz, who I believe is the director of psychiatry at Cornell University. And it's called The Power of Different. And she identifies that maybe we need to stop looking at this as a brain illness and start looking at it as a brain difference. And she identifies that a lot of individuals who we might diagnose today as having a brain disorder actually had some genius qualities. So maybe individuals who experience certain mental health issues actually have certain strengths that they aren't able to express in this day and age because of the sick society. So let's take a look at a few examples. These aren't necessarily something that she proposed in her book, but just from my own research. So what are some of the inherent strengths of individuals who experience depression? Or melancholy is another term that has been used for this. These individuals tend to have a really, really strong ability to empathize. They're generally called empaths. They can feel the pain of people at a much higher degree than the normal population can. They have an ability to think very deeply about certain issues. They're able to think about things from a different perspective than a lot of people are able to. A lot of these people are visionaries because of their ability to think about things in depth. And a lot of these people are leaders, again, because of their ability to think of certain things. So some examples of this are Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln talked extensively in his journals about having a melancholy that followed him everywhere and having this unshakable ability he had this inability to shake it off. Martin Luther King, he surprisingly actually attempted suicide on multiple occasions. And thank God he was unsuccessful, but it's very possible, I don't know exactly why, but it's very possible that he really felt the suffering of his people in society. And that's actually what led him to become the person that he was. Everybody knows J.K. Rowling, the writer of Harry Potter. She talks extensively about her experience with depression. Again, someone who's just a great thinker, right? What about inherent strengths of people who have anxiety or people who struggle with anxiety? These people tend to be very meticulous and organized. They tend to also be really good at detecting potential threats as well as immediate threats. They're very good at assessing the environment to find out maybe what the threat is, able to just assess social issues and say that these are the potential downfalls of if we go forward with this action. They're very highly attentive to details, and they tend to be risk averse. So Gandhi, I don't know, Gandhi, if you've read his autobiography, Gandhi talks extensively about how his initial attempts at public speaking, were, failed miserably. Like there were multiple times where he stepped on stage and he froze to a point where he couldn't even speak and he had to walk off stage. If you were to describe that nowadays to a clinician, they would probably diagnose you as having social anxiety. Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was, it wasn't like he was the first person to be exposed to the idea of evolution, but because he had such a meticulous brain and meticulous thought pattern, he was able to really determine that, there's something going on here that other people aren't recognizing. If you know the history of Charles Darwin, his anxiety probably got the best of him, or he probably would have been diagnosed with OCD, but it got the best of him towards his later life. And he actually wasn't able to leave his own home for multiple years. And then Einstein. Einstein, you know, some theorists think that Einstein probably had some form of obsessive compulsive disorder or ADHD, but again, just a very meticulous thinker, right? Someone who was very organized, someone who paid very specific attention to detail. What about something like bipolar disorder? Now, bipolar disorder, for those who aren't super familiar with it, is something of a cycling mood disorder where an individual experiences mania, where they have have a very grandiose sense of self, very high energy. They cannot sleep for many days. And then they'll sometimes flip into what's called into a depression, right? A melancholy state. These individuals, research has show an exquisite ability to be creative. A lot of the leaders we have in our society today that have bipolar disorder are extremely creative people. They also tend to be really resilient. They find that these individuals are very resilient to trauma. It's very difficult to traumatize these people. And they tend to be very linguistically versatile. Like people who are just really slick with their words tend to have bipolar disorder. So one individual who, historians look back and say probably had bipolar disorder is Winston Churchill. Again, an amazing orator, but someone who really flipped in his mood on a regular basis. Frank Sinatra, same thing, one of the greatest musicians of our time. Ernest Hemingway, again, one of the great authors of our time, very creative mind. And again, all these people you can see are very slick lyricists. What about some people who experience schizophrenia, or people who have divergent thinking? Now, one of the characteristics of schizophrenia are that these individuals sometimes have an inability or a difficulty distinguishing between reality and imagination, which is actually what allows these individuals to be very highly imaginative. They're very able to undergo what's called thought experiments, to engage in certain thoughts, to be able to experience their thoughts very vividly to a point where they're able to test reality in their own mind. They're very good at outside the box thinking. So Isaac Newton, they say maybe had bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, but he definitely showed some psychosis in his life, in his later part of life. Have anybody seen the movie A Beautiful Mind? This is John Nash, who's considered one of the fathers of modern day economics. And this is Syd Barrett, who is one of the founders of Pink Floyd, one of the revolutionary bands of our time. So this perspective, when we look at it from this perspective, that maybe there's not something wrong with individuals who experience these different mental health issues, but maybe there's just something different. It really aligns well with what evolutionary psychology says about mental health. Now, evolutionary psychology comes from the angle that there's no way, like in this day and age, they say at any given time, 1 in 4 people struggle with a mental illness. And throughout their lifetime, 1 in 2 people have struggled with a mental illness at some point in time. Evolutionary psychology says that just can't be true from an evolutionary perspective. Evolution doesn't make mistakes like that to such a large degree that an individual can struggle with an illness at that high of a degree. So it says that there must be something different here that's going on. And the way evolutionary psychology looks at this is that it looks that we all grew up in tribes, right? For hundreds of thousands of years, we grew up in small tribes. And each person in a tribe had a role to play for that tribe to be successful. So maybe we need to have certain peoples who were very deep thinkers, people who maybe were a little bit more prone to depression, to be the leaders of that tribe. Maybe we needed people who had anxiety, who could detect threats in the environment, who were the protectors of that tribe. Maybe we needed very creative minds, people who maybe struggled with bipolar disorder, to be people who were able to think of new ways of problem solving. And maybe we needed people who were just very highly imaginative, again, to do some problem solving. So from an evolutionary psychology perspective, these probably weren't considered illnesses. They were just differences, and they were actually needed differences in order for tribes to survive back in the day. And that also aligns well with what we consider the neurodiversity theory, which is that there's no wrong type of brain. We all just have brains built differently for different reasons. There's this experiment. I'm debating whether we have enough time to talk about this, but there's this one experiment on learned helplessness that kind of demonstrates how a society or a sick society or sick environment or an unhealthy environment can lead to mental health issues. So they did this one experiment where they put dogs in a cage. It's a really cruel experiment. It happened in the 70s, back when ethics wasn't really a thing. And they put dogs in a cage, and on one side of the cage, there were some shock sensors on the ground, and on the other side of the cage, there were no shock sensors. So what they did was they made a beeping noise, and they sent out a shock. So the dogs were shocked when they heard the beeping noise. Now, the dogs would go to the other side of the cage and realize that when the beeping noise happened, they wouldn't get shocked. So they learned that they can escape that one part of the cage and move to the other part of the cage and no longer get shocked. However, they put a second group of dogs in the cage where no matter where they went in the cage, they would continue to get shocked. And what those dogs learned was that no matter what they did, they could not escape shock. They could not escape pain. And now what they did after that was they took those same two dogs, those two groups of dogs, and they put an environment where they had to swim in order to get to a place of safety. And what they found was those dogs who had learned that no matter what they did, they were always going to experience some type of pain. Those dogs gave up really easily. They learned to be helpless, right? So they were exposed to a really helpless environment, and then they picked up that life is helpless. No matter what I do, I can't escape. So perhaps that's something that we experience in our society too. So I want to, this is kind of a structure that I developed just to kind of explain this idea of how maybe there are certain social norms and certain social situations in our society that make us feel like we're stuck or make us feel helpless. Now, inside the box, if we fall inside the box essentially defines how we are supposed to be, how we are supposed to act, and how we are supposed to think in this society. Think the way society tells us we're supposed to think, then we fall inside the box, or act or think, then we fall inside the box. However, if we don't abide by that, then maybe we fall outside the box and we feel like an outsider. So when we have this inside the box, outside the box structure to our society, it breeds disconnection, it breeds exclusion, it breeds competition, and it breeds self-comparison. This might be a little confusing, so I'll just jump into it to kind of give you an idea. So number one, our society tells us there's a certain personality style that we're supposed to have. That's extroverted and introverted. Our society tells us that we need to be extroverted, right? When we go to college, we're supposed to be the life of the party. We're supposed to go out. We're supposed to have fun. We're not supposed to sit at home and read and think. We're supposed to be extroverted. So if we're extroverted, we fall inside the box. That's considered normal. That's the way we're supposed to be. If we're introverted, then, we feel like an outsider. Relationships. Now, this probably hits home with a lot of people in this group. In our society, in Indian culture, you're supposed to be married, right? If you're married, great. If you're unmarried or divorced, God forsake, then you sit outside of the box. That's not the way that's not the way it's supposed to be. You're supposed to be married. That's what our society tells us, especially our Indian culture, right? We're supposed to be married. What about family? We're supposed to have children, right? We're supposed to have multiple children. If we don't have children, then, you feel like a lot of eyes are on you. You feel like maybe there's something wrong with you. What about employment? Now, I chose these three images very deliberately because you have a doctor, you have a lawyer, and you have an engineer. This is what our culture tells us we're supposed to be. We're supposed to have a job that is lucrative, respectable, and stable. If we are not sitting at that point in our life, then we feel like there's something wrong with us. We feel like we're sitting outside the box. We're not normal, right? What about appearance, right? We're all supposed to be attractive by social standards, right? We're all supposed to be, and if we're not attractive by social standards, then we're considered unattractive. And a very specific example that applies to our Indian culture is light skin versus dark skin, right? It's very common that we're supposed to be light skinned, right? That is considered more attractive in our culture. In fact, to a point where it's a $1 billion industry in India, as well as in Indian communities, to have skin lightening creams and skin lightening, just other concoctions or whatever it is. But what's considered attractive is something that is very socially defined. What about gender, right? Now, this is a very important issue that we're covering in our society. Inside the box is cisgendered, and cisgender just means that you're the gender that you were born to be. So if you were born a male, then you're a male, right? And if you're born as a female, you're a female. But if you're transgendered, then you really feel like you're an outsider. You feel like society doesn't accept you. What about intelligence? I think this is a really important point. And there's this quote by Einstein that I find to be really profound. And he says that everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it's stupid. So how do we measure intelligence in our society? Strong school grades, right? If we have strong school grades, then I'm considered intelligent. If I don't have strong school grades, then I'm considered dumb, right? I feel like an outsider. I feel like there's something wrong with me if I don't have strong school grades. And we very much need to recognize that our school system is designed to serve very specific minds. It's designed to make us learn in a very specific way. So there's naturally going to be a tendency for people to get poor grades, not because they're dumb, but just because they learn in different ways, right? But they may feel dumb, just like Einstein said, because the education system is built in a very specific way. Our body. We're supposed to have the ideal body type. We're supposed to be slender. We're supposed to be beautiful. If you're a guy, you're supposed to be muscular. If you're a girl, you're not supposed to be too tall. If you're a guy, you're not supposed to be too short. We have these different body types that we say in our society that these are normal and this is the way it's supposed to be. And if you feel that you don't fit into that box, then you feel like an outsider. Sexual expression. Our society is much more accepting of heterosexuality than it is of individuals who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, or anywhere else on that spectrum. Again, if you identify as something other than heterosexual, then you probably have faced some form of discrimination in your life, some form of feeling like an outsider. And what about mental health diagnosis? This is another big one. No mental health diagnosis means you're inside the box, you're mentally healthy. However, if you have a mental illness diagnosis, then you're considered outside the box. Something's wrong with me. I'm not normal. Something's different about me. And you try to fit inside the box, which is probably why a lot of people, the percentages are like 50% or higher of people who have mental health issues that don't reach out for help because they don't want to get that label, right? And in a lot of cases, it's justified because sometimes if you have that label, you are discriminated against, or you are, you some type of stigma. So what happens when you sit outside the box? You face some form of social exclusion. You face probably some feeling of loneliness. And we know that loneliness is a huge predictor of physical and mental health issues. You've probably faced some form of oppression in your life. You've probably faced some form of discrimination in your life. You face some form of external pressure to change, right? You are told that you're like, if you have dark skin, you need to be light skinned. If you identify as being gay, no, you should be heterosexual, right? Like we face a lot of pressure to change if we're sitting outside that box. We feel a lack of self-acceptance because we're told by society that we're not acceptable. And we engage in a lot of self-comparison. We're constantly comparing ourselves to the people who are inside the box. Now there's this quote from one of my favorite Nas songs, and he says that people do anything to be involved in everything. And he says, inclusion is a hell of a drug, right? That when we create the system where we feel we need to be included, it really can drug. We feel like we need to, and we feel like it's important. But what about when you're inside the box? What are your mental health outcomes when you're inside the box? And the truth is that a lot of people who are inside the box face the same issue. They're not just as likely, but they're still highly likely to experience mental health issues. Now, why is that? One of them is pressure to stay within the box, constantly feel the need to be a certain way. If they have experienced getting good grades, and they feel the pressure to keep getting good grades as a form of validation. So the problem is not the box, but that we create these rigid social norms that don't serve anyone. They hurt people who are inside the box and outside the box. It breeds chronic self-comparison, right? Which is a major issue that we have in our society. And I talked about how being inside the box isn't necessarily better. There's been some research done on kids who are from affluent families. Again, they grew up in a very privileged environment, but there's a lot of pressure on them to get good grades and stay affluent. And they found that a lot of these kids feel such immense pressure to maintain that status in their life that they experience significant anxiety or depression, actually at a higher rate than the rest of the population does. So being inside the box isn't necessarily going to protect you from these issues. So what do we have to do? What's one of the goals? It's not to be inside the box or be outside the box, but the goal is to completely remove the box entirely. We need to create a society that's more inclusive, more accepting of different ways of thinking, different ways of being, different ways of living. There shouldn't be one way, one rigid way that we're supposed to live, one rigid way of being in our society. That can really breed mental health issues. And this, when we have that box, can really breed a sick society that can contribute to mental health issues in people. Okay, so I believe that is, oh no, sorry, I have one more thing. I'm not sure about my timing. I'm probably going way over time already. Okay, so there's this one study that I found to be really profound. It's not a well-known study, but it's a really clinically sound study. And it was done by this researcher at Stanford University. Her name is Tanya Luhrmann. And what she did was she studied people who would have been diagnosed with schizophrenia or had auditory hallucinations where they heard voices. And she studied it across different cultures around the world. She chose 3 countries specifically. The first country was America, second country was Ghana, and the third country was India. What she found was, of the 20 participants she studied and interviewed in America, was that all 20 of them experienced some form of violent, negative voices. Almost all of them experienced voices that told them that they should kill themselves, that there was something wrong with them, that they were crazy, that they don't belong in society. They all experienced this. However, when you move to Ghana, in a society where hearing voices isn't necessarily considered an abnormality, that maybe it was considered even a spiritual gift, people in these societies, over half of them experience positive relationships with their voices, where the voices even offer them spiritual guidance or moral guidance in certain situations, something that you didn't see at all in America. And then when you go to India, you see the same thing, where these people who had relationships with their voices, they found the voices to be playful. In a lot of cases, they found the voices to be spiritual in nature. And the conclusion that the researchers drew from this was that the voices that were heard were a reflection of the social norms and social messaging in that part of the world. So if you were told that if you have a mental illness, or if you heard voices that you were crazy and there's something wrong with you, then you were much more likely to experience voices that were very hateful. Okay. All right. So the first half was kind of looking at mental health from a very macro level. Now I want to shift to looking at it from a micro level. How can we focus on improving our own mental health? And again, there's innumerable ways, innumerable ideas on how to go about this, but I want to focus on it from a very specific angle. Okay. So taking perspective on your own mental health. Now, this word perspective was chosen very deliberately because when we struggle with mental health, we very much struggle with taking perspective. Now, one example of this is that when we struggle with our mental health, we become very highly focused on what some social psychologists call the small self, which is the self that very much identifies with our identity. The self that feels like the world kind of revolves around us, the self that feels like it's alone, like it's very separated from the world, which is it aligns very well with Vedanta and what we call the small s self. But when we experience mental health issues, we become very focused on that. And what happens is when we're very focused on that is we experience tunnel vision, where we only see a certain perspective on our life issues. We also experience what's called catastrophization, where we take a small issue that's happened in our life, or small problem, and we tend to make it this big explosive problem that's going to lead to multiple issues down the line in our life. It also comes with this feeling of I'm carrying the world, again, because we feel like maybe the world is revolving around us. We feel like everything is we feel like there's a spotlight on us. We engage in something called mental filtering, which is we filter out all the negative things that are happening all the positive things that are happening in our life, and we only allow the things that are negative to filter into our life. So we become very hyper focused on the negative. And we start to jump to conclusions too, where we start to take something with very little evidence and we jump to a conclusion and we start to generalize and say that that's the way things are. So again, it's like we feel this spotlight on us. And when we don't have that perspective, it becomes very tough to actually gain some perspective. So at that time, one of the things we can do is see a therapist, right? That's what therapy actually, if I had to describe what therapy is and what it does, is it gives the individual some perspective on their problems, some perspective on their life, some perspective on their strengths, what they can use to kind of get through. Maybe it even give them some perspective on certain skills that they can start to adopt. And it doesn't necessarily need to be a therapist. I just put that in there. It could be a friend, like a friend or a social support that gives you perspective, someone who can kind of jolt you out of very hyper focus, that tunnel vision on that small S self. So seeing a therapist can give us a little bit more perspective. And now once we have a little bit more perspective, we can start to, once we moved out of that red zone in the continuum into the orange zone, now we can start to shift forward a little bit. But we do sometimes need that perspective. We need to get out of there. So what's another thing we can do to take even more perspective? And the more perspective we had equates to better and better mental health. So another step we can take, oh, actually, sorry, this is something that is like, it's something that allows us to take perspective. It's like a self-help worksheet. It's called a 60-second reality check because it's really quick when you're feeling like things are stuck for you. You can ask yourself some of these questions, which is, what just happened really matter to me in the long run? How big of a deal is it? Is this going to matter in 24 hours? Is this going to matter in a week? You could even go, is this going to matter in 5 years? And sometimes asking those questions does give you some perspective. You know, my issues that I think are so big are actually not as big as I think they are. So how do we gain even more perspective once we've gotten a little bit of perspective? How can we improve our mental health a little bit more? One of the things that we can do is having deeper relationships. Now, this is something that's been studied a lot recently with the recent study on how much loneliness is an issue in our society and how loneliness has very detrimental effects on our health. One of the things they found to counter this is having deeper relationships. Now, they did a study in the 1970s where they asked people, how many people do you have in your life that you feel you can go to when you're in crisis, that you can go to no matter what, right? Just someone that you have such a deep relationship that no matter what happens, you can go to them. And the average answer back in the 1970s was 5 people. Each individual on average had 5 people they could go to when they really needed some help. Now, they asked the same question in the current decade. I don't remember what exact year the study was done, but they asked them in the current decade, and they said, how many people can you go to in crisis? And they asked everybody, and the average answer in this current decade is less than 1. Less than 1. It was like 0.7 or something like that. So in our current society, the depth of relationships that we have with people is completely lacking. So when we're feeling lonely, when we're feeling distressed, do we have someone that we can go to give us that perspective, that can give us that support that we need? In most cases, the answer is no, right? We have a very hyper focus in our society on quantity of relationships. Do I have this many followers? Do I have this many friends, etc. Right? More friends equals better. More friends is inside the box, right? But what actually matters, what we know from the research, actually can help fight against loneliness is through deepening our relationships, having deep relationships with people. Another thing we can do is serve other people. Now, what this does is it allows us to shift our focus from ourselves and shift focus again onto other people, right? Now, this can kind of be taken in multiple ways, but what we want to do, and the right way to do this is, like, it's very possible sometimes when we serve others, we're also serving ourselves, right? Because now I helped this person, I'm a good person, or that person sees that I served this person. Now, I got that person's recognition. One of the ways that research shows that we can practice this is to engage in something like a random act of kindness, where we're not going to get any recognition at all, where we're literally just doing something for someone else, just because we want to help that person. It's not like they would know. It's not like anybody else would know. We don't want to go about and say, hey, I did a random act of kindness today, because that would be counterproductive to the issue. But when we do find that when people are actually engaged in service of other people, they do tend to be happy. Gratitude. Now, I know everybody's heard this term gratitude a billion times, but what gratitude actually does is that we have, evolutionarily, we're supposed to detect threats. We have this animal part of our brain, our fight, flight, freeze response. That part of our brain often takes, it's a little bit, it's very fine tuned, right? Like it's really strong in some of us, in a lot of us, right? We tend to lean in that direction where we tend to see what's wrong with our life, what's wrong with our environment. And what gratitude does is it really shifts us out of that mindset, because when we do get stuck in that mindset, we are more susceptible to depression, to anxiety, right? It's very much, especially anxiety, is very much a result of being caught in that fight, flight, freeze response. So what gratitude does is it does shift us out of there. So engaging in some form of gratitude on a regular basis, whether it be a gratitude journal, can really have that effect. And that's kind of the neuroscience behind it, that it does shift us out of that part of our brain. The other thing that give us perspective is journaling. Number one, what journaling does is it takes these subconscious ruminating thoughts that are constantly going through our mind and helps us get them out. Now, there have been a lot of research showing that something called expressive journaling, which is just writing down all the emotions you're feeling, just going deeper and deeper and deeper into your emotions and writing without any hesitation, that can really help people who have experienced trauma to overcome their trauma. Because what it does is it really taps into our subconscious, and those ruminating thoughts that are kind of going on below the surface, which is very much what trauma does, is it very much acts on our subconscious, and it allows us to get some of that out. The other thing is visualization. Now, our brain actually doesn't necessarily know the difference between what we're seeing and what we're imagining, right? What we're actively imagining. So engaging in some form of visualization. I know Vivekji has posted a visualization on YouTube in a sunflower field. Actually being able to take ourselves into that environment is actually tricking our brain into thinking that that's actually happening to us right now, or even visualizing, what am I going to do if I encounter this situation later? Maybe you're really nervous about a presentation or something like that, or you're nervous about something going on in your life. Being able to visualize, how am I going to deal with that situation? How am I going to be able to deal with this future situation, can really help, create a neural connection that we previously didn't have in our brain. So these things help us take a little bit more perspective. The next thing that allows us to take perspective is something that I find really fascinating. It's called awe. And there's been a lot of research on this subject. It's called the science of awe. And now what awe is essentially, and I think you've all experienced this feeling before, but it's something that really jolts you out of yourself. It's something that really shatters your, what you thought was possible, something that really supersedes any expectation that you could have possibly had about something. And it's like, whoa, like it really puts things into perspective where you almost forget about yourself. You're just caught in that moment. It really shifts you into that moment. So I like this example of the Taj Mahal because, no matter how many times I've seen the Taj Mahal, no matter how many times you've seen pictures of the Taj Mahal, even this picture, you're like, oh, what's so great about that? When you actually go and you see it, it takes your breath away. You're like, whoa, that is amazing, right? So something like that experience can really shift you out of focus on self, and now all of a sudden you're very focused in the moment. You experience this sense of awe, right? Some amazement. Another thing is maybe your experience, and a lot of awe is triggered by experiences in nature, right? So maybe you're traveling through India and you experience the Himalayas for the first time in your life, and you're like, oh, I never thought mountains could look like that. I never thought there would be a mountain range as exquisite as this. Like, it really jolts you out of what you thought was possible, and you experience this sense of awe. Maybe if you're like me, being at the Toronto Raptors championship parade can fill you with a sense of awe, where you're like, whoa, look at the community of people that have gathered here. What an amazing experience. What a gathering. Just a feeling of unity that you get from being in a crowd like that. Nothing you could have done or thought of could prepare you for that moment. Or maybe you've experienced great moral leaders, right? You're just in awe of these great moral leaders. Sorry, I think that's the wrong guy. Someone like this, right? So maybe you're in the presence of a great moral leader, someone who just completely shatters your ability to think, I can't believe a human being can be like that. I can't believe, and this is actually what they found, research has found, that being in the presence of great moral leaders or great people are actually what is the most likely to give you the experience of awe. And I think we've all experienced that. Maybe we've experienced it being in the presence of a Swamiji or someone else. We experience this, wow, how can this person be like that? How can this person live like that? How can they have such a pure and clear mind, right? It really jolts us out of ourself and makes us rethink how we perceive the world. So we feel awe when something violates our normal understanding of the world or breaks our conceptual framework of what is possible. Now, one really profound experience of awe is some of the astronauts who traveled into space and looked at the Earth for the first time experienced this sense of awe. And I'll give you a couple of examples of some astronauts who looked down on Earth, and it completely shattered their ability to even conceive that this experience was possible. So this one astronaut, her name was Catherine. She said, "It's hard to explain how amazing and magical this experience is. First of all, there's the astounding beauty and diversity of the planet itself, scrolling across your view of what appears to be a smooth, stately pace. I'm happy to report that no amount of prior study or training can fully prepare anybody for the awe and wonder that this experience inspires." Then another astronaut also said, "You've seen pictures and you've heard people talk about it, but nothing can prepare you for what it actually looks like. The Earth is dramatically beautiful when you see it from orbit, more beautiful than any picture you've ever seen. It's an emotional experience because you're removed from the Earth, but at the same time, you feel this incredible connection to the Earth like nothing I'd ever felt before." So this points out to a couple of things. One is that nothing could prepare you for that experience, for that awe experience. It also tends to be a very emotional experience. You tend to feel this connection with something much greater than you, which is something that we're seeking. So what happens when you experience awe? Number one is you feel your understanding of space shifts. You start to feel like you are so much more vast than you were before. Your sense of time expands. You tend to start to feel like you have much more time on your hands than you did before. Your mood significantly increases, again, because you stop identifying with that small s self, that small self, and you start to feel like you're part of something bigger. You have more perspective on your life. They find that people who experience this awe feel a much more deeper spiritual connection with themselves and with the universe and with God. An interesting finding was that people who experience awe on a regular basis actually decrease materialistic tendencies that are less likely to purchase things, and they're more likely to seek positive experiences. And lastly, they feel a connection with everything. They experience this diminished sense of self. So that's awe. So what happens when we experience awe is that small self starts to dissipate. And when that small s starts to dissipate, we start to feel happier. We start to feel elevated, right? We start to feel a deeper connection. And that's what we're seeking when we want to improve our own mental health. Where are places that we can experience more awe? Nature is one of them. Going to concerts, musical performances, hearing having just very beautiful musical experiences or concerts or whatever it is. Being a part of a community can give you that sense of awe. Being a part of some religious gatherings or ceremonies, experiencing monuments like the Taj Mahal, and especially most importantly is being around people who are profound leaders, people who really jolt you and make you think that that a person can be this great, right? And it makes you feel like you can also be that great. The last part, which is very connected with awe, is something called wonder. And wonder is very much, so awe is something that you experience when an external stimuli, like you witness nature, you witness a concert, something that happens through your senses. Wonder is something that you create in your mind. Okay, and we very much talk about that in Hinduism, where we try and contemplate on the infinite, or we try and contemplate on Brahman. What we're doing is we're really trying to wonder and experience what this could, like something that we can't possibly comprehend. We're trying to wrap our mind around. And again, that diminishes that sense of self. So we're trying to grapple with something that is incomprehensible to us, and it kind of takes us to a different state of mind. It makes us forget our individual self. Some quotes that really struck home with me that we might reflect on that can give us this sense of wonder. One is by Paramahansa Yogananda, is that I am the spark from the infinite. I am not flesh and bones. I am light. In helping others to succeed, I shall find my own prosperity. In the welfare of others, I shall find my own well-being. I am infinite. I am spaceless. I am tireless. I'm beyond body, thought. I am utterance, beyond all matter and mind. I am endless bliss. When we really try and wrap our heads around that, we start to engage in some form of wonder, and we experience awe, not from some form of external stimuli, but by contemplating it in our own mind. And again, when we're able to do this, our level of mental health and happiness can really expand, right? So just to kind of give you a sequence of what we just talked about, when our mental health is really poor, we really get stuck in this tunnel vision. And then what we can do to get out of that tunnel vision is, one, see a therapist or talk to someone that gives us just a little bit more perspective on life. Thirdly, we have a number of things that we can do to even give us a little bit more perspective on life. One is to deepen your relationships. Another one is to serve humanity. Another one is to practice gratitude, journaling, engaging in some form of visualization. All these things help improve our mental health, and especially can give us some perspective. Then maybe we want to engage in some awe. I really recommend that people travel a lot more, seek experiences rather than buying that new car that you're thinking of buying. Go on a major trip, just buy the Civic instead, or buy the Mazda in my case. And seek those experiences, things that will really expand your understanding of what is possible. Because that could decrease your sense of identification with the self. And the last thing is wonder. Engage in regular contemplation, something that really puts your place, makes you feel, bigger than you actually are. It puts your small self in a different place.
I just want to say thank you. I really appreciate everyone being here for this. I feel blessed for this opportunity to talk to you all and express something that I'm really passionate about. So my deep gratitude to everyone for showing up. And some of you can reach me if you need to. You know how to. You can reach me over Facebook.